afternoon. Welcome. This is the event Challenges Faced by President Sheinbaum. I'm Sandra Diaz, narrative coordinator here in Alianza Americas. This is an analysis of the circumstances regarding the challenges faced by President Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico. We have interpretation available.
You may enable the English interpretation by finding the globe icon at the bottom right of your Zoom screen. Este evento es coorganizado.
This event is co-organized by Alianza Americas and its member organizations, Mexican Networks, Collective of Transnational Women,
Illinois Workers in Action, Durango
United in Chicago.
Resistance y Alabama Coalition on AIDS. La dinámica de esta
The
conversación.
dynamic of this conversation will be the following. Every one of the presenters shall present 3 key points regarding each topic. At the end of each presentation, we will open a space for a question and audience from the audience. For this, we invite you from this moment on to write down all of your questions in the Q&A box that's in the bottom part of your screen. The presenters will be able to read and we will try to respond to all the questions as possible.
Y les recuerdo nuevamente que tenemos el
And
servicio.
remind you once again that we have interpretation available from Spanish to English.
You may enable the English interpretation by finding the globe icon at the bottom right of your Zoom screen. Para iniciar esta conversación,
To begin this conversation, first I want to welcome our presenters. Thank you for being us here this afternoon. And to begin this conversation, we're going to invite Leticia Bonifaz Alfonso, lawyer and doctor in law in the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. She's a teacher and consultant in human rights, gender equality, justice procurement, legislative techniques, indigenous groups, and alternative law. Since November 2020, she's a member of the Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women of the United Nations. She has published several articles, academic articles, and opinion articles regarding human rights and gender. Thank you for being with us and supporting us to understand key elements regarding the recent judicial reform in Mexico. I'll give you the next 15 minutes for your presentation.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I think that when we talk about the challenges faced by the president, there are several, but I would place as the most important one that we still don't see if it will happen or not, is to stand completely as far as possible from her predecessor, which will be difficult to do. But what I think is crucial here, that this reform was presented days before her predecessor exited office, and what was left in her path was a poisoned apple for the current president, because the judicial branch has a very big complexity, and excluding the cases of the Constitutional Court of Bolivia and minor cases, when it comes to the election of judges will be something that's very complex when it comes to the election, when it comes to the profiles that will be selected. But also, what's serious here, it will end the judicial career, and instead we will be seeing very improvised judges. All the time that it takes, what would be called the learning curve for these new judges, will cause serious damage to the people who have sought justice for years now. So the judicial reform has a premise that it's a false premise, in the sense that the judicial branch cannot invalidate things done by the legislative branch, because the judicial branch was not chosen by the people. That was the premise that made by the former president, when he would say, how can you say the law comes from the judicial system if the judicial branch was not chosen by the people, and who made the laws were chosen by the people? So what's the solution? Let's also have the people choose their judges. Obviously, this is not a solution. On the contrary, it throws in the gutter a judicial career that it had already been consolidated. And especially for Catalina and myself, many times we've had to receive training courses when it comes to human rights, with gender perspective, with infant perspective as well. And the topic and the issue here is that not all judges need the same preparation. Maybe in some topics such as uh, practice theory or the general theory of law, they might share the same courses, but the current judges are specialized in the civil matters, in judicial, in labor issues, administrative issues, and the ones that are going to arrive now, they haven't thought about because they haven't even mentioned it. They don't even know if they will have the same profiles. So there will be a learning curve that will take a long time. And I believe, take into consideration the what we recently occurred with the other reforms, that will take even longer than the 6 years of the Sheinbaum's term, and the results that we will not have quick or expedited justice. On the contrary, the trials that already began will take even longer to finalize. And among all of this, the people that will be most affected by this will be those people that are minors or victims or are part of a conflict. And in their cases, 2, 3, 4 years is a long, long time if it has to do with topics about receiving custody battles, of minor restitutions. So the judicial reform, it has differentiated impacts depending on who are the victims, who have asked for this justice, and who had in one way presented or will soon present a lawsuit in any of these areas. That is one of one of the most serious problems that I can see. And the second one, which has been which attention has been focused on a lot, but hasn't been said, they haven't mentioned where the risk is who are going to be the judges that are going to be chosen. And everybody says they say that the drug traffickers are going to place these judges. But I know that in this forum, there are many people from all around Latin America, and the recent experience that I've had a lot of contact with several countries in Latin America. In my case, what worries me the most, and I don't think there's a way to know for sure if you're able to stop it or not, is that throughout all of Latin America and the Caribbean, we have a greater presence of people from the far right linked to religious groups who are very organized and who have a lot of money. So when it comes to electing judges, who won't tell us that these religious, very well organized groups, they can also be placing candidates and also putting to risk a lot of the advance that has been made and the progress that has been made when it comes to human rights, because currently the court is already at risk because of the integration of judges with profiles that are very, very conservative, and especially those types of judges that put into danger women and ethnic groups. Why? Because what they have, they focus on abortion and gender equality. And the Inter-American Court had made a lot of progress on these topics. And I think it's an inheritance that unfortunately can be lost in the short term. On the other hand, the mixture that we might have of judges that will remain and the judges that will arrive won't also have a very healthy dynamic in the Supreme Court. We already nowadays we already have samples of how the 823 votes is well defined in the court. We don't know how it's going to be comprised, but what is clear is that currently there are reforms already being made to the recent constitutional reform because they noticed where there were key points that not only had lack of coherence, but at the same time they were simply contradictory. The transitional article, which mentions that there can only be a literal interpretation for this reform, is an article that's very delicate, that I don't think that they didn't even have an idea of that they themselves were placing a straitjacket on themselves, and it could be contributing for their interests or shooting themselves in the foot, because to say that there can only be a literal interpretation for anybody who wants to interpret the reform, they themselves are institutions like the National Electoral Institution. They wanted to make sure that the court would interpret it, but there is no way to interpret this constitutional disposition. And the consultations that are being made in the Supreme Court have to do with how we do a systematic interpretation. And in summary, because I know my time is about to finalize, what the court is discussing today is if a constitutional reform can be unconstitutional when it comes to if it goes against fundamental principles. What fundamental principles are at risk? The separation of powers, the judicial autonomy, and I am not going to think about certain human rights issues, but it could be about the principle per person or the principle of progression of the rights. So what I believe is that these laws and the reform itself, they still give us a lot of possibilities that the interpretations are going to be in senses that are completely different than the constituent had the intention of doing so. So to finalize, the other serious issue here about the permanent constituent is that the legislation controlled by Morena, the political party Morena, without even reading it, they approve the reform because it's impossible to have read it. In theory, we are facing a permanent or reform to the Constitution that has a majority in the states that they can approve pretty much any reform with any content. And what has to do is they have to see if the court can invalidate when a constitutional reform attempt goes against the basic constitutional rights. I'll leave it there, and I'm ready for whatever's waiting for us later on. Thank you.
Muchas gracias,
Thank
doctora
you
Bonifaz
very
Alfonso.
much,
Los elementos que presenta nos
Dr.
permiten
Bonafis
tener un
Alphonse.
mejor
It
contexto
allows us to
de
have
los
a
reformas
better
que se vienen.
context of
Les
what this
recordamos
constitutional
a los
reform
asistentes que
implies,
pueden
reminding
hacer sus
the people
preguntas
that
y
are
recibir
present, you can be
posteriormente
placing your
respuestas
questions
a Q&A
in
en la
the
barra
Q&A
inferior de
box
Zoom.
at the bottom part of
Ahora vamos a
your Zoom
pasar a otro de
screen.
los temas más
Now we're going to
polémicos
move
de
on
este
to another
periodo,
most
la militarización y
controversial
la
topics
reciente
from the
reforma
previous
constitucional
presidential
que pone
term,
el
the
control de la Guardia
militarization and
Nacional en
reforms
manos de la
that places the
Secretaría
control
de
of
Defensa
the
Nacional,
National Guard in
SEDENA.
the hands
Para este
of
tema tenemos
SEDENA,
con nosotros
the
a
Ministry of
Catalina
National
Pérez
Defense.
Correa,
For this,
maestra y
we have
doctora en Derecho
Catalina
por la
Perez
Escuela de
Corres, a
Derecho de la
master and a
Universidad de
doctor in
Stanford, en
the
California.
Stanford
Ha
University in
sido docente e
California. She
investigadora
has been
en
a
investigación
teacher and
sobre la
investigator in
Universidad
different
Nacional Autónoma de
institutions,
México y
such
el
as the
Centro
National
de
Autonomous University of
Investigaciones en
Mexico
Diseño
and
Económicas,
the
CIDE, y
Center
el
for
Center for
Investigations and
International
Economic
Human Rights
Teaching,
en la
SEDE,
Escuela
and
de
the Shell
Derecho
Center
de
for
la
International
Yale
Human
en
Rights
Estados
at
Unidos.
the
Actualmente es
Law School of
investigadora
Yale,
asociada de
the
Centro
U.S.
de
Currently,
Estudios
she's the associate
Constitucionales de la Corte
investigator in
Suprema
the
Federal
Constitutional
o Corte
Studies
Suprema
Center
de la
of the
Nación.
Supreme Court
La
Justice of the
doctora Pérez
Nation.
Correa
Dr. Perez
ha
Correa
publicado
has
varios
published
libros
several
sobre
books and
reformas
articles
sobre el sistema penal
regarding the
mexicano, la
Mexican penal
política de drogas en
system,
América Latina,
the policy
el
of drugs
castigo
in Latin
penal y
America, the penal
militarización de
punishment, and
México.
militarization in
Así que
Mexico.
bienvenida, doctora. Le
So,
daremos unos
welcome,
15 minutitos
Doctor.
para su
I will give
presentación.
you 15 minutes for your
Muy
presentation.
bien, muchas gracias Sandra y muchas gracias por la invitación.
Thank
Me
you very
gustaría
much,
tratar de
Sandra, and
ser
thank you very much for the
muy
invitation.
rápida porque
I'll
es
try
un
to
tema muy amplio el tema de
be
la
brief
militarización en México.
because the militarization is
A
a
ver,
very wide
así
topic in
nomás
Mexico.
muy rápido, no me quiero meter
I don't want to
toda la
go
militarización que
into
ha sido en
detail
México,
to
pero
what
sí el
specifically is
presidente
militarization because there has been a discussion here in
puede utilizar
Mexico.
el término
So
militarizar
for
para referirnos a los
militarization,
puestos civiles,
I'm going to
a las
use to
fuerzas
refer to the
armadas y
transfer of
aquí
roles and
hay
budgets,
tres
civil
formas de
budgets to the
interpretar
armed
la
forces. So there are
participación
three
del
ways to
ejército
see
en
it. The
la
first
seguridad
one
pública, que
is the
es la
participation
cuestión
of military
dentro
in
de la
public
cual
security
entra el tema de la
issues.
Guardia
And
Nacional
this
y
is where it
también
comes to the
entra
National
militares
Guard, as
y
well as
militares
the
enfocados
military
a administración
participation in
pública,
public
como mencionaba,
administration
sería
tasks,
también
which has
la seguridad
nothing to
pública.
do with public
Y otro es
security.
también el tema
And
de
the other one
seguridad,
has to do
porque
with how
en tareas de seguridad locales ha
in the
habido la
local
contratación de
military
medios militares
institutions,
para
there's been
darle
hiring military
característica
personnel
de entrenamiento
for
militar y disciplina militar
military
a estas
training, and
agencias
they've
en todo
been
nuestro
incorporating
país,
these military
aquí.
personnel to these civil
Primero creo que
agencies.
sí me gustaría
First of
notar
all,
que
I
esta
think
es
it
la
would be
reforma que se
good
acaba
to
de aprobar
note
por la Corte
something that this
Constitucional
reform that
en
was
la
recently
Guardia
approved
Nacional.
when it
En
comes
realidad no
to
fue solamente
it wasn't
una reforma para
only a
transferir
reform
al
to
Ejército
transfer to
Nacional
the
a la SEDENA.
National Guard to
Una
SEDENA. It was much
sanción
wider than
porque
this. So I think this is important to
siempre el
mention
cambio
because
de
I feel
mando
that
es la
it's
reforma que
almost
dio
deceiving to say that it was the
transferir
reform
la Guardia
that gave the
Nacional a la
transfer to
SEDENA.
the National
Además
Guard to
de
SEDENA.
hacer
So besides doing
este
this,
cambio
besides
administrativo,
this administrative
la reforma
change,
incluyó
the
una
reform
parte
also
de la
included
Constitución
a part to the
faculta al presidente
Constitution
utilizar
where
las
it gives the
fuerzas
president the power to
armadas
use
para
the totality of the armed
utilizar
forces
directamente.
for
Y eso
public
los saca de
security
los controles
directly.
constitucionales que
So
había, los
this
cuales
takes
había
in
que
all the
pasar
constitutional
por
controls which it had to
Congreso
go through
para
Congress
poder
so that
utilizar
the
a
president
las
could
fuerzas
be able
armadas.
to use the
Me
armed
parece que esto es
forces.
importante
So I
porque
think
no
this is
solamente
important
es
because it's
militar
not only the
ayudando a las
military,
fuerzas
like
de
the
seguridad
National Guard
pública,
doing public
los
security
militares o la
tasks,
militar
but the
establecidos haciendo
military,
tareas
the
de seguridad
Marines are
cumpliendo
doing
los
public
deberes.
security issues according to
Luego
what the
también
president
se amplió el
wishes.
fuero de guerra, no
It
están
also
prohibidos los
they
tribunales
also
militares en México,
increased
excepto
the
los militares,
war
y se
reach
amplió el fuero
and
militar para los
it
miembros de la
increased
Guardia
it
Nacional. Es decir,
for the members of the
la
National
Guardia
Guard.
Nacional ya
So the
tenía
National
un
Guard already
disciplinado
had
civil,
a
ahora va a tener uno que decide en
civil
los tribunales
disciplinary
militares para
regime,
los
and now
casos
the
en
military will
donde
also have it for those cases
altera la
where
disciplina militar. ¿Qué ha pasado en
there's a
México
transgression
también?
of the
Este
military
fuero se ha
discipline.
utilizado
So
para
what
darle
happened in the past in
impunidad
Mexico?
a los
This was
militares
used to give
mexicanos en los
impunity
que
to the
hay incluso
militaries, in
civiles
which cases
involucrados
where there are
en
civils
casos
being
de delitos
involved
ambientales, de
in
gente que es ajena al
human rights
ejército
issues or
y
people
lo
who
cual
are
se veía
external to
como
the
muy
army.
importante
So I think
porque
it's very
hay que
important
entender también
because
elementos
there are
externos. Ahí también
130,000
ya la
elements
disciplina
or
depende de los
personnel,
tribunales
and they
especiales,
all
que son
depend on these special
tribunales
tribunals.
paralelos a los
And these are the
tribunales
parallel
civiles que tienen
tribunals,
su
parallel to
forma
the civil
de operar, que no
tribunals.
tienen los
In the
mismos
way they
criterios de
operate,
transparencia y de
they
independencia.
don't have the
Y el
same
último es la
criteria for
reforma al artículo
transparency. And the
129
final one is the
del
reform to the
Constitución,
Article
que lleva
129 of
más
the
de 160
Constitution.
años. Pues
It's
bueno,
existed for
prohíbe
almost
los
200
militares
years
realizar
now,
labores que la
which
Armada
didn't
no puede
allow
realizar.
the military
Y
personnel
se
to
reformó
do
este
different
artículo para
tasks. So
permitir
they
a los
reformed this
militares
task
llegar a
to
pelear
allow
en
the
el
military
frente
to carry out
a
tasks
aquellas
that
regiones que
those
son
roles or tasks that
pacíficas
are not
y en las
included
que
in our
los particulares,
Constitution
pues hay
and are included in the
límites
secondary
que los
laws.
militares puedan hacer,
So
ya está
it changes completely what the military
establecido
personnel are allowed to
por
do,
la
the
Constitución.
power that they have to do.
La Guardia Nacional es un
The
cuerpo
National
federal,
Guard is a federal
tiene los
organism that
poderes
has
reglamentados
at
en la
least
ley,
44
entre
powers
los cuales está
in the
limitar la
law, among them
comunicación
to
de personas, la
intervene in the
prevención del
communication
delito,
between
la custodia de
people,
centros
interpret
penitenciarios, la
the
investigación
in
del delito,
investigation of the
participación en
crimes,
estudios conjuntos,
to participate in joint
incorporar los documentos
operations, to
de
inspect
y
documents
a personas
from
migrantes,
and
llevar
detain
a cabo
migrant
operaciones
people, to
encubiertas
carry out
y hay
undercover operation.
unas
And
facultades
there are
muy
some that
vagas
are
como
very
garantizar,
vague, like, for
mantener
example,
el
guarantee,
orden
maintain, and
social,
reestablish the order and
realizar
social
investigación
peace,
para la
carry
prevención
out
del delito, es
investigation
decir,
to prevent
detener delitos
crime.
de espionaje militar
So
antes
the
de que se
first,
cometa el delito
before a
militar,
crime was committed,
investigando para que
there
no
could
se
be
cometa.
investigating somebody so the crime
Y
does
esto, pues
not
claro,
occur.
está en un
And this,
régimen
of course, is within
disciplinado, como
a
decía,
disciplinary
de
regime,
militares
like I mentioned, for the
con las
military,
facultades y
with
no tiene
many, many powers, and there are
¿no?
no
Y
clear,
entonces, bueno, esto es
clear
un
civil
aspecto
controls.
que es muy
So
preocupante.
there's a part that's very worrisome.
Y aquí nada más una última
And
parte, los
here,
militares
just one
todavía
final thing,
queda un
the
poco de
military
trabajo
here,
por
I'm going to
hacer
mention
y
something
estamos
about
muy
this,
pocos en
an
la Comisión
investigation that we
Permanente
recently concluded
de la militarización.
about the militarization or
Realizamos
the national
este
inventory
estudio
of
con
what is
varias
militarized.
organizaciones
We did this among several
de
organizations,
investigación
Intersecta,
de
Mexico
investigadoras,
United, and
en el
the
cual básicamente
program
queremos
of the policy
saber qué
of
facultades
drugs
se
to
han
see what
dado a los
powers have
militares
been
en
given
México.
to the military in Mexico.
Y entonces, pues, no
So
queda claro esto,
it's
entonces
not
empezamos
clear.
a
This is
perder
not clear. So we
competencias de
try
lo que
to
ha
better understand
dado como
what
facultades
has been given
a los militares. Y
to
encontramos
as
como dos
powers to the
vehículos
military. So we
para
saw
lograr que esto
two
sucediera.
general
Uno es a
vehicles where
través
this
de la
is
promulgación
one
de
is
normas
through
generales en el
promoting
Congreso,
general norms in the
reformas
Congress, like
constitucionales
constitutional
constitucionales que
reforms,
se han aprobado,
secondary laws that
acuerdos
were approved,
presidenciales que se
uh,
emiten,
presidential
o
decrees
la
or
otra vía
treaties,
que
or
por
the
ejemplo
other
los
path, which we
procedimientos de
thought was
acuerdos
very
particulares que
interesting,
funcionan como una
which are
especie de
they function as a
contratos
sort of
entre una
contracts
dependencia y otra
between
dependencia, y
one
estos no
agency
son
and
públicos,
another
no
one.
se
And these are
difunden, no
not
se
public
comunican a la
agreements or
población. Y
treaties,
ahí
and
pues
these are
las
not made
compañeras
known
en
to
las
the public.
instituciones de las Fuerzas
And
Armadas
any of the
pueden confirmar
armed forces
que SEDENA
institutions
y ya sea las
and
instituciones federales o las
whether the
instituciones
federal
estatales
institutes the state institutions or the municipal institutions. We saw that between September 2006 and August 2023, a total of 87 initiatives were presented in the Congress to increase the military functions or powers. Of these are the different legislations divided by years, and the majority were presented between 2018 and 2023. So, in other words, this process was accelerated during the López Obrador presidency. And this is what he is inheriting for Claudia Sheinbaum, all of these powers, all of these resources that are outside of the traditional controls of the Constitution. How many have been approved of these initiatives presented? 2 have been approved with constitutional reforms and 12 with legislative reforms. And all except 1 were approved in the previous 6 years. And this is interesting because he claimed to be more left-leaning, but instead what we saw there was a more accelerated militarization process compared to the previous governments. And then we have the treaties and decrees. We saw that 19 of these documents, all of them issued by the President López Obrador, some of them were instruments that created. So where are the companies for, like the construction companies, some companies for tourism companies in order to create hotels, things that had nothing to do with the National Guard or security, but with these economic incentives that the people now have. 2 of the agreements, what they tried to do was classify everything related with, like, classify as national security. So they were exempt from the obligations tied to any organization when it comes to carry out things in a transparent way and how they utilize resources and the decisions that are being made throughout while these works are being done. So a lot of money, a lot of resources, but no transparency. And then we have these agreements and particular agreements. We saw that 207 conventions or agreements of SEDENA, which, like I mentioned, they're sort of contracts that are given among SEDENA and a federal institution. So this is important because the resources arrive in the federation budget to a specific agency, maybe the public education ministry, and it's given through they contract SEDENA through a convention to carry out the construction of the military bases, and they're assigned part of the budget that originally was going to be given to the Secretary of Education. So when we see the federal budget and we see the resources that the Federal Armed Forces has, it's very high, the equivalent of several institutions of the federal government. And we see that throughout these conventions, they've been given more liabilities and more resources to the armed forces. Of all the agreements and conventions, 222 include civil budgets. So it's not only they're given powers and responsibilities, but the budget is transferred to the armed forces. And my time is going to be up soon. It's not only about public security, but instead other functions of public administration that has been given to the armed forces, mainly to SEDENA. Some of the roles that have been given to them have been the power to raise awareness regarding addictions, build hospitals, plant trees. There's also some farms. There are things that are very far away that have nothing to do with public security. The transfer as well of a Mexican artist who was provided. We found the convention where SEDENA would transfer the body of a very famous singer. Well, the majority of these conventions for the governments have to do with public security. In the federal government, the majority have nothing to do with public security. And I think this is important because it's this logic of the armed forces where they're being provided or they've generated economic incentives in entrepreneurial logic for the armed forces, which is very far away from their constitutional role for the armed forces, which is the defense of the nation and of the borders. So what do we have nowadays? To the armed forces, they're carrying out several responsibilities that have to do with public security. They've been giving the control, the migratory control. And here we can discuss how much has to do with public or national security, or if it has nothing to do, protecting the borders, the highways, the airports, the seas, customs, everything is in control of the military. And I think this is specifically serious in the context that was being shared by Leticia Bonifaz, which has to do with the disappearance of the judicial branch, or the concept of how all the powers are comprised with judges with different profiles. It's they're weakening the judicial independence within this context of militarization. And this is the context through which Claudia Sheinbaum is assuming the power, taking control of the government. And one of the questions is, how are the armed forces going to behave with a new president, and how limited will she be to assume the roles of the armed forces when they already have so many powers? So it's important to mention that the armed forces have a different judicial regime compared to the other civil institutions, not only because of their military jurisdiction, their standards are very different. They have a work regime that's very different. So they're having so much budget means tying many, many more things to this war regime, and all these hotels and companies and customs, the migratory will not pass through the ordinary civil justice. They will have a different justice system. So all the violations that we see when it comes to detaining immigrants, everything that we're seeing in the press that's happening in the southern border, they don't go through the ordinary tribunals. Instead, they're passing through the military tribunals. And just one more minute, and I will finish. And the evidence that we have shows that the armed forces in Mexico, they have not reduced the violence. And on the contrary, we have evidence that actually makes things even worse. The violent situation is even worse in the country, and they put the population to risk. Once again, we're seeing the stories we just saw on the southern border, the murder of several immigrants, that it was a mistake. And they always happen within a context where the military are carrying out patrols, but they are heavily armed, and at the end and it ends with excessive use of force and civilians dead. So the final point, the militarization strengthens the armed forces in the face of the civil power, the way it's carried out, and also represents a problem for the system of counterbalances and an obstacle for democracy. It's not only they're outside of, besides this weakened judicial system explained by Dr. Leticia Bonifaz, but without passing through the ordinary democratic channels, because the roles are being given not only with discussions taking place in Congress, but through the approval of these Congresses that are being done in private and without making them known to the public. I will leave it there, and I hope I didn't go over time, but if you have any questions, we can discuss it later on. Thank you.
Gracias. No, no se ha pasado
Thank
del
you.
tiempo.
No, you
Estamos
didn't go over
en
time. We're
el
doing really
tiempo
well with
de
our
un
time.
recordatorio a la
So I
audiencia
want
de
to
que tuvimos
remind the audience that you can send your questions,
una buena cantidad
and we will have a
de
good amount of time to
y
respond
sin
to the
duda la
questions.
discusión sobre las funciones
And the discussion about the rules that have to be complied by the armed forces is always a controversial issue, especially in a society like ours, who has suffered repression of the human rights from these armed forces. And when it comes to the context of violence being faced by the country, they require the minimum issues of defense and security. Thank you. The next topic is very important for the future of Mexico. Claudia Sheinbaum has experience in climate change, and there is an area of hope, a renovated hope with her in the presidency for the country to address the energetic transition in a country in which the
juegan un papel
hydrocarbons play an
importante en
important
el
role
Producto
in the
Interno
gross
Bruto.
domestic product.
Para tener un mejor contexto
To have a
del
better context of the impact of
está
climate
con
change in
nosotros
Mexico,
Eduardo Vega,
joining us is Eduardo
maestro
Vega
en
Lopez,
políticas de
Master
Alta
in Public
Comunicación
Policies
Pública
and
por el
Public
Instituto
Administration
Tecnológico
for the
y de Estudios
Technological
Superiores de
Institution and
Monterrey.
Higher Studies of
Ha
Monterrey.
impartido
He
cursos de
has
licenciatura y
given
posgrados
imparted
especializados en ciencias
licensed
económicas,
courses
ecología,
and postgraduate courses
desarrollo
specialized in
sustentable,
economic
desarrollo
sciences,
regional,
ecology,
urbano, entre
sustainable
otras áreas
development, regional
ambientales. Desde
development,
febrero
and
de
other
2024 es
areas.
el
Since
titular
February
de la Coordinación
2024, he's the
Universitaria
head of
para la
University
Sustentabilidad
Coordination
en
for
la Universidad
Sustainability
Nacional
in
de
the
Sonora.
National Autonomous
Muchas
University
gracias
of
por estar con
Mexico.
nosotros,
Thank
maestro.
you very much for being
Tiene
with
15
us.
minutos.
You have the next 15 minutes.
Muchísimas gracias a ustedes.
Thank you very
Es un
much to
gusto para
you.
mí
It is a great
compartir
pleasure
este
for
espacio
me
con
to
Leticia
share this
Bonifaz
space with
y
Leticia
Caterina Correa
Bonifaz
y la
and
verdad
Caterina Perez
la
Correa,
amabilidad y la
and
gentil invitación que
the
recibí
kindness
a
and the
través
invitation that
de
I
Hazel
received
Contreras.
through Hazel Contreras.
Estoy más que contento.
I'm more than
Muchas gracias,
happy.
Sandra, por
Thank you
la
very much,
introducción.
Sandra, for
Y
your
voy al grano.
introduction. And I'm going to cut straight to the
Voy a
chase.
compartir
I'm going to
pantalla
share
también.
my screen as
Espero
well.
que
I hope that
estemos viendo la
you're
presentación que tengo
all
preparada.
seeing the presentation
Si
that
es
I have
así,
prepared.
muchas gracias. Muy
Please,
amables.
thank you.
Bueno,
Thank you.
yo lo quiero plantear de la siguiente manera.
I want to propose in the
Evidentemente,
following
con lo que acaba
way.
de decirnos
Because
Sandra,
of what
la
Sandra just
presidenta
mentioned,
Sheinbaum
President
conoce
Sheinbaum
este tema.
knows this topic
Ha
really
sido
well. She
formada
has
en
been
diferentes
trained in
universidades,
different
en la UNAM, por
universities, in
supuesto,
the
como
UNAM,
tesis,
of course, that's where she
en
started,
estos asuntos.
in these
Y
issues,
es bien
and
conocido que
it's
no
well
es ajena
recognized
entonces
that she is
el
not
mundo
external to
de la política
the
energética, de la
energetic
política
policies
ambiental,
when it comes to
y en
environmental
particular los
policies, and
énfasis
in
que viene
particular,
haciendo
the
acerca
emphasis
de
being
la
made
importancia que
regarding
juega para
the
su gobierno
importance
el
for her
asunto
government
relacionado con
when it
cambio
comes
climático.
to talking
Entonces,
about
por eso
climate change.
pongo este
So
énfasis en el
I place
título,
this emphasis on the
oportunidades de la
title, the
política ante el
opportunities
desafío del
of
cambio climático en
policies of
México para
politics
este
in the face of
sexenio
challenges of
2024.
climate change in Mexico for the following 6 years,
De acuerdo
2024
a
to
lo que
2030.
me han pedido,
According to
quisiera
what
hacer
I've
tres
been,
énfasis
they've
iniciales y a
asked me to
partir de
make
ellos, pues,
focus on three key
desarrollar
points,
algunas
and based
preocupaciones
on those,
adicionales.
develop some
Yo quiero
additional
plantear estos tres
concerns.
al menos,
I
para
propose
abrir
at
boca,
least
digamos.
these three
Uno
to
es,
get this ball rolling.
digamos, son parte de las
One of
realidades
them,
que
part
ya
of the
vivimos, no son
realities that
solo
already lived are
escenarios de
not
futuro,
only
no son solo
future
desafíos, son
scenarios,
ya
they're not only
realidades
challenges, but
tangibles
they
que
are
tenemos
tangible
enfrente
realities that we
y
have in front of us.
experimentadas en los
And
años
we've
recientes.
experimented in recent
Entonces,
years.
estas
So
realidades,
these
desafíos y
realities and
políticas
challenges and
del cambio
policies of
climático,
climate
yo
change,
las puedo organizar en estos
I
tres
can
énfasis
organize
que
them in
debieran
these
ser
three
entonces
emphasis that
prioridades
that should be
La
public
primera, sin
priorities.
duda,
The
la
first one
transición
is without a
a las
doubt the
energías
transition
renovables
to
y
renewable
un uso
energies and an
eficiente del
efficient
sistema
use
eléctrico
of the
nacional
national electrical
completo.
system, complete
Y
one.
ahí va todo lo concerniente
And
a
this includes
medidas
everything
eficaces de
regarding
mitigación de
effective
emisiones,
mitigation
adaptación a las
issues,
consecuencias
adaptation
adversas
to
de
the
estas
adverse
realidades y desafíos del cambio
consequences of these
climático,
realities of climate
otorgar
change,
certidumbre
to
institucional,
grant
servicio eficaz y
institutional
inversión directa,
guarantees,
no
effective
por 1
service,
o por
and
2
direct
o
inversion,
5,
not for
sino
1, 2, or 5 years
todo el sexenio
investment,
y
but
los
during the
años que
entire
siguen
six
al
years
mismo,
and the
porque si
following
no,
years.
no
Because if
vamos a
not,
trascender
we will
los
not
escenarios que nos
transcend the
preocupan.
scenarios that
El
concern us.
siguiente énfasis es
The
la
second
conservación de
emphasis has to do
bosques,
with the
selvas,
conservation of
manglares,
forests,
biomasa marina, entre
manglars,
otros
marine
ecosistemas
biomass, and
importantísimos
among
que
other
son
important
reconocidos en
ecosystems,
las
which
otras
are among
condiciones
many other
que nos
functions
ofrecen
that
estos
are being
ecosistemas,
offered by these
son relación con
ecosystems
cambio climático,
with relation
son
to climate
sumideros
change.
naturales de
These are
carbono. Y
natural
esos sumideros
places where
naturales de
carbon
carbono,
is
entonces por su
harvested. So,
funcionamiento natural
because of its
propio,
natural and
pues
ecological function,
secuestran o capturan
they
el
sequester
carbono,
or capture
lo
carbon,
almacenan allí
they
y
store it
permiten
there,
que las
and they make it
emisiones que
possible
se
for
generan
these emissions that
en
are being
nuestras
generated
viviendas,
in our
ciudades,
homes, in our
industrias,
cities, in
campos de
our
cultivo, cultivos de
industries,
riego,
in the
generación de
fields,
aguas
in
residuales,
generation of
etcétera.
residual
Pues
wastewaters.
esa,
All
ese cúmulo
these,
de problemas
this accumulation of
conservan
problems
los bosques,
conserving the
conservan los
forests,
manglares,
conserving the
biomasa
mangroves,
marina
and the marine
como
biomass
sumideros
these are natural storage places for carbon. We have the additional opportunity to generating capabilities for these emissions that we will continue producing. Well, they would have the possibility to be fixed somewhat and gradually with public and community benefits that are very, very important. The third emphasis, which should be another opportunity for public policy, is that how we're going to, since we're going to continue, whether things are done well or not, we will continue with issues, with severe issues related to these adverse impacts and which are linked to climate change. In other words, tropical storms, very copious tropical storms, hurricanes with much more frequency and intensity, problems associated with heat waves, to droughts with greater territorial coverage and greater duration and intensity and affectations. So they affect the harvest, the crops, the livestock, people, they cause death, etc. All these issues, we will continue registering them, unfortunately, because, oh, we already have enough accumulation of greenhouse effects emissions in the atmosphere, which already changed. It's not that they're going to change with high probability. No, they already changed the rain regimes, of the temperatures, of ventilation. So all this that we know as the adverse impacts that are going to continue presenting themselves, well, we have to then tend to them with explicit civil protection policies, early alerts, and attention to local emergencies and regional emergencies that we will have to go to those places to tend to those people, to those localities, cities, infrastructure, and everything else. These are the three emphasis. So, what would I do to have success in this opportunity that we have the next 6 years? We shouldn't have to invent many things. We have to make the most of the knowledge we already have and the commitments that we've signed and that are current among with other organizations, like for example, United Nations. So the so-called sustainable development objectives. So let's make the most of them. And then we can see that in this objective of sustainable, of accessible energy and non-contaminating energy, we can't link it. We can articulate in the best way and explicitly with the corresponding objectives and the goals of each of the rest objectives of sustainable development that I will place in this slide. We all know that we know that there are 17. I'm only going to mention 10 of these, but we have this explicit objective with an emphasis of accessible energy and non-contaminating for action for climate to avoid more adverse impacts from climate change. And since we know that terrestrial and marine and submarine ecosystems, well, let's make public policies in order to so we can have less inconvenient scenarios in the future, whether it's either a long, midterm, or very long term. This policy, with this emphasis, it should also be translated into industrial policy as well, an active, explicit, which induces in a very notable way what is being said in the next objectives for sustainable development. Industry, innovation, and infrastructure, there's no doubt that we need a coefficient industry and that contaminates much less and transitions to photovoltaic, geothermic energy, biomass energy, etc. And all of this would generate different circuits compared to the ones we have nowadays, as told by Objective 2 in responsible consumption, and number 11, to transition gradually to sustainable development and sustainable communities. This will bring additional benefits in the amounts and the quality of the water that we have, and the well-being and the health of the people. And without a doubt, it would reduce in social inequalities, which are included very notably when it comes to gender inequalities, because precisely there is inequality in the adverse consequences. Not everybody faces the same costs associated to how serious these inconveniences related to climate change can be. Now, if we would take this very seriously, which I hope we do so, we can identify four additional emphasis. The most that I've seen the most. We need to reorganize the economy. Of course we do. We need to make it grow, yes, or much more than we've done so far. But we also have to measure the gross domestic product per inhabitant, an economic growth that explicitly is being worrying about what benefits it would bring to the population, the Mexican population. The second one would be the percentage of non-fossil combustion and electricity, but in relation to fossil fuels, which is where we are still basing the energy matrix for the country. Number three, how much energy in general does the national economy need in order to function well? So we're talking about that third variable, about how, if it can be carried out, that energy, about economic growth per inhabitant. And number four, the rhythm of the decarbonization economic or energy consumption with less entropy. Those four variables can be placed here, always related with time, of course. The timeline at the bottom is very important. So then we can measure it in the following ways. What we have experimented so far is insufficient growth with an inertial energy policy based on fossil fuels. There has been a lack of interest when it comes to climate. What we want to do is move from that situation that we have nowadays, this polygon that we can see right now, that could illustrate like the situation that can be measured, and where we want to go, where we could go, the opportunities that we have on hand are precisely the ones with a more dynamic economy per inhabitant, and that we can begin the energy transition towards renewable energy and an efficient use of fossil fuels. Precisely for the one that already began, this one, 2024 to 2030, because I'm sure that they are already designing and thinking and proposing the first draft, which would be pretty soon. I would say it has to be 6 months according to law. Within 6 months, we should be able to get to know the National Development Plan for 2024 to 2030. So of the situation that we have right now, with these new emphasis, which are associated to climate change, we want to move on to this not just different situation where the relationship of growth per inhabitant has a greater content of non-fossil fuel consumption, where in general the energy matrix is less required when it comes to volume and energy flow to produce 1 unit of gross domestic product. Then we would also be generating, as they say in the polygon, or illustrated in the polygon with a blue dotted line, fewer emissions equivalent per unit of consumption of energy consumed. This is called to reduce the use of carbons in energy consumption. If you can achieve this in the next 2, 3, or 4, 6 years, we will be taking a very notable step in order to begin in the following years towards 2050, 2100. Then we could have explicit policy of sustainable economic growth measured precisely by the active energy transition with these considerations that I'm mentioning, and this could be drawn in the following way.
Now, I'm going to move to the next slides so as not to try take over the 15 large minutes. So the benefits of doing this that I'm pointing out and not wasting the opportunities that appear in the current context would have the following. Of course, hurricanes will still be presenting themselves every July, August, September, October, November. Every year, there will be hurricanes in the Pacific coast that has an effect over all of our coast, but we also have them in the Atlantic and the Caribbean and all the states and municipalities that are part of this eastern part of the country. But we have the information that is available in the government has this information. And here I'm sharing a web page where you can find all of the information of the economic costs and social costs of hurricanes in the recent years. So we would not have to avoid every year and just include certain years as examples, but every year we have these images, these social costs, these worries that come from the loss of social well-being. We have some other pictures here. Last year, this was 2007, 2015, 2023. Sorry, these are this year's 2024 actually. So we could share pictures such as these for each of the years. So we've measured this, and I'm closing with this. We know which are the municipalities that all hurricanes have come in through, and what the damage has been for people and products. And so these are the 25 municipalities that have been worse hit. We see Acapulco there. This is not surprising. Otis and John are not surprising. If we know it's going to happen, let's do something beforehand. The other thing are the droughts. And here, instead of registering and suffering the adverse effects of drought, we would have to start transitioning towards renewable energies and making efficient use of fossil energy with which we will probably have to continue living with for many years. Thank you very much, Master Vega, and thank you for this analysis of the environmental conjuncture in Mexico. So yes, we know that the hurricanes have hit very hard in Mexico. We've come to the Q&A section. I would like to begin with 3 questions so as to continue with the questions. For Dr. Bonifaz, we have the next question. The government is divided in 3 branches. Could we interpret that the judicial branch has disappeared? And regarding militarization, what is the perception of Mexican society regarding the role of the armed forces in these civilian activities? So what's the point of Mexico? What point is Mexico at regarding militarization? And what would be the final point? Could it become like a police state? And the next question, how can climate change affect food security in Mexico, and how is this situation driving forced displacement of communities that are facing conditions of life that are not sustainable? And I'll leave all 3 questions for you, so you might think of your answers, but we'll begin with the first one for Dr. Bonifaz. Very well, says Dr. Bonifaz. We cannot say that the judicial branch disappears, but that it is hurt in such a way that it cannot be a counterbalance in a division of powers that exists, so that there is a counterweight, and that the judicial power right now can invalidate a norm and requires, with the previous legislation, required 8 votes from 11, and now there will be 6 from 9 ministers. But the validation of the norms will be almost impossible because the legislative minorities that could invalidate an unconstitutional norm don't exist because they have majority in both chambers. Morena has a majority. And today, an action from the Guanajuato government, but can only be promoted by Guanajuato, Querétaro, Jalisco, and Nuevo León because everything else is Morena. So the judicial branch is frankly weakened and is no longer the counterweight, which is indispensable for a democratic state
Gracias, doctora.
of
La
law,
segunda
rule of law.
pregunta y la
And then the next
sobre la
question, the second question
militarización, ¿cuál
regarding
es la percepción
militarization,
de la
what is
sociedad
the
mexicana
perception of
ante el
the
rol
Mexican
desarrollado desde estas
society
funciones
regarding the
civiles?
role of
¿En
the
qué
armed
punto se
forces in the
encuentra
civilian
México en su
roles?
militarización y cuál
At what
sería un
point is
posible
Mexico
punto
at
final? ¿Y en qué
regarding this, and
posible,
what could
es
be a
posible
final
que se
point?
convierta en un estado
And is it
policial?
possible for
Sí,
Mexico to
a ver,
become a
son
police
varias
state?
preguntas, no
Well,
las voy a
these are
intentar
various
responder
questions. I'm not
todas.
going to try to answer them all.
Pasa algo en toda
But
América
something
Latina,
happens in
no
all of
nada más
Latin
en México,
America, not only in Mexico,
la
where
gente, sobre todo en estos
people,
contextos de
especially in
inseguridad,
these contexts of
prefiere las
insecurity,
políticas punitivas de
prefer
mano
punitive
dura, y
policies,
entonces más cárcel, más seguro de
more
vida, de hecho se les
jails,
habla de pena de muerte, de
even
personas
death
que
penalty
consideran que está
spoken
bien. Y
of.
pasa
Some
algo
people
similar
agree
con
with
las
it.
Fuerzas
And
Armadas
something
mexicanas.
similar
Las
happens with
personas
the armed forces in Mexico.
ven
People
que el crimen
see
organizado
that organized
México
crime in
está
Mexico
fuertemente
is
armado y entonces piensan que con
strongly
militarizarlo se va a
armed
resolver.
with weapons, and
Y
they
es
assume
difícil
this is the way to
explicarles
solve
a
it. And
la
it's
gente que
difficult to
por qué meter a más
explain
personas a la
why
cárcel, por qué
this
poner a
won't
los
solve it.
militares
Why
a
putting more
patrullar,
people in
y
jail while
no
having
sirve,
more
sino que
military
perjudica las condiciones
policing?
de violencia. Además, la pregunta
Not
es
only
general
does it
y esto
not help,
a
but it
partir de
worsens the
los
situations of
Guacamaya Leaks que
insecurity.
hubieron
The After the
en
Guacamaya
el 2020,
leaks
sobre todo,
that
que
took
vimos
place in
el
Mexico,
enorme
Colombia, and other
aparato
countries,
de
we
comunicación
recognize
que
the
tienen las FARC. Nos
huge
encontramos
communication
que
apparatus that
tienen
we
realmente
find
muchos
that they
recursos
have
destinados
a lot of
a
resources
mejorar la imagen de
destined
las
to
Fuerzas Armadas,
improve the image of the armed
telenovelas,
forces,
TikToks,
soap
hay
operas, TikToks.
influencers que están
We have influencers
promocionando
that are
y
promoting
encima pues
it.
tenemos
And on top of that, we have this conflagration between the
y las Fuerzas
Alberas
Armadas, ¿no? En Estados
and
Unidos
the armed forces,
desde que llegó él
and
aquí en México está
the
encargando la bandera y entonces
oh, sorry, the
criticar
flag
a
in the
las Fuerzas Armadas
military. In
es criticar
soccer
a
matches,
su
they come
sistema
in
al
with a
país y me parece
flag.
que
So
es
it's
un tema
difficult to
bien delicado.
explain this to
Pero
the
pues no
country.
no es una
It's a
buena
delicate issue.
política, no es
It's not
una
a good
buena
policy. It's
idea tener a
not a
los
good
militares
idea to have a
con muchos recursos
military
sin
with
capacidad,
so many resources, with no
metidos con la posibilidad
oversight,
de espiar,
with the possibility of
a cargo de la
spying
protección,
and
el
being in
control de las
charge of the protection and the
telecomunicaciones, de todas
control of
las entradas del país, de
telecommunications,
la
if
política
of
de
all the
gases, del agua, etcétera,
incoming
sin los
sites to the
procesos que se necesitan
country without
y
the
sobre todo sin el sometimiento a
counterbalances
las
that are
autoridades
needed
civiles.
and
Nunca nos tocaba
without
en esto
true
a la
absolute
mano porque
submission to the
es
civil
riesgoso.
authorities. This has never worked in Latin
No quiero
America.
hablar
It's risky.
de
I
una
can't really talk
repetición
about a
como ha sucedido
repetition as that
recientemente
has
con
happened in other
los
moments of
golpes
the
militares.
history
Me
with
parece que es un
military coups
fenómeno
d'etats.
distinto que estamos
This is
viendo,
a
que hay que
different
entender
phenomenon that
con cuidado, pero
we're seeing
ciertamente
that we have to
difícil
understand carefully, but
sin
also that
que
it is
la
difficult
población
to
entienda,
make the
sin
population
que entienda sobre todo los
understand,
riesgos que habría que enfrentar.
especially the risks behind it.
Claro, muchas gracias.
Of
Y la
course, thank you very
pregunta
much. And the
para Mr. Vega
question
es,
for
¿de qué manera el cambio climático
Professor
está
Vega,
afectando la
how is
seguridad
climate change
alimentaria en
affecting
México y
food
cómo esta
security in
situación está
Mexico, and
impulsando el
how is the
desplazamiento
situation
forzado de
driving forced
comunidades que
displacement of
enfrentan
communities
condiciones de vida
that are
peligrosas?
facing conditions of life that are not sustainable? Yes, without a doubt, food security is being affected. If we look at it with the loss of crops, I mean, not only legumes and fruits, but specific products that are highly consumed by everyone, beans, corn, rice, sugar, all of these crops are being affected, whether by one of the two extreme phenomena that are derived from climate change. One are the floods, and the other one is the droughts. So while losing crops, there's less internal offer of these goods that translate into agro-industrialization process, and finally our day-to-day food products. And so we end up having less effort. The demands for food continue, and the effect in relation with these prices is elevated. So inflation derives also from climate change associated with food insecurity. And climate migration, there's no doubt, also affects decisions of localization and human settlements and their mobility. And we see in the narrations and the stories, more recent stories with the flooding in Acapulco, that many people who have lost their things have decided to move away from that places, looking for a new place to live, who knows where, without a job, without any money, with a policy that receives and helps, and it's very complicated. So, of course, we're talking about very serious topics that might severely harm the well-being of people and raise the product of common
Gracias.
goods.
Y la siguiente pregunta
Thank you.
creo
And the
que
next
viene a ser
question, I
complementar. Acaba
think,
de
comes from
preguntar,
the same topic that you
pero
were just
se
talking
repite
about,
si es
and
que
I'll
quiere ampliar
repeat
en
if you
esto.
want
En
to
el contexto de las
talk more
decisiones
about this in the regarding
militares, ¿qué
of
medidas de
natural disasters.
adaptación y
What
mitigación son
adaptation and
urgentes
mitigation
para
measures
proteger a
are
estas comunidades
urgent
más vulnerables?
to
¿Y cómo
protect these
podrían
more
estas
vulnerable
acciones
communities,
influir
and
en la
how could
migratoria tanto en
these
México como en México?
actions have an impact on migration policy in Mexico and the region? Yes, we have to adapt initially with the correct information, public information, and transparently. Adaptation is super important. So if there are risks of heat strikes, flooding, droughts, so that's a way to adapt, but it's not something that only organized society has to do. For example, or universities. Of course, we do, and we will continue doing so, but it is a public policy priority. It is the responsibility of the state to inform the population of the risks they are facing. That is one way. The other one is the creation, the building, the budgetary support for obtaining the eco-efficient infrastructure. This might mean building of protections for flooding in rural areas to protect from more affectations for the people who live there. There's many ways to intervene in the territory facing these threats of climate change. If that is packaged with budget, I think, in a policy of adaptation, of adequate adaptation measures, then we would have an immediate benefit, more so than there will keep on being floods and droughts in the upcoming years. Immediate benefits because of the population will have less daily costs while facing these issues.
Gracias, maestro Vega. La
Thank
siguiente
you,
pregunta
Professor
de todos
Vega. The next
de la
question
audiencia,
that
les
we
recuerdo
have
que aún
from the
tenemos un
audience,
poco
I
de tiempo
remind you
para
that we
seguir
still have a little
respondiendo,
bit
así
of
que si
time to
quieren
keep
mandar
on
las
answering
preguntas,
questions. So
tenemos
if you want to keep on asking
minutos
questions,
en línea por el
we
momento.
only have two lines on
Esto sería
queue
sobre
so far. So
reforma
this would be
¿Cuáles
regarding the
podrían
judicial
ser las
reform, which
implicaciones
could be
de
the
esta reforma judicial en el
implications of
acceso a
these
la justicia y la
judicial reform in
protección
the access
de los
to
derechos
justice and the
humanos,
protection of
particularmente
human
para la
rights,
comunidad migrante
particularly
y
for the
refugiada
migrant
en México?
community and refugee community in Mexico? Regarding the migrant community, the thing is that already there's very few trials where migrants participate because usually Mexico is still a wayward site. It's what they want to go through. They don't want to have a long trial. Of course, the response times will take longer trials that have already begun, and that is already a disincentive, if more so now that we know that clearly this will take much more time now. So there are groups that are more affected. And what I was saying regarding human rights is that all of the training that for years, basically since 2012 until now, we have repeatedly training judges regarding human rights. Now, the ones that are coming will come from scratch. We'll start from scratch and we'll have to retrain. This takes time, and having a human rights perspective, a gender perspective, a childhood perspective is not something that the previous systems in the schools took place, but rather it was really in while the judges were already in the judicial track with training. So doing this, if the people will be able to vote for their judges, I believe already that there will be very little participation because of the complexity of the 800 names, or I really don't know how many so far. The most delicate thing would be that the judicial power will be detained for a while.
Gracias, doctora.
Thank you,
La
doctor.
siguiente
And the next
tengo,
question that I
estos
have
tres invitados.
is
¿Cómo
regarding all three
podemos
guests.
vincularnos con
How
las
might
personas
we
mexicanas en el exterior
Mexicans
en el trabajo
outside of the
de
country
incidencia en
in
México?
the advocacy work in Mexico?
Y le puedo dar la
And I'll
palabra
give the
a
floor
Catalina,
to Catalina,
solo porque es la que
just
habló.
because
Ya acaban de hablar los otros dos invitados, así que se la dejo.
she has not
No,
spoken.
a ver, creo que hay distintas
And
formas
I think there's
de hacerlo.
different
Las redes
ways
sociales
of
a veces
doing so.
permiten
Social media
tener mucha más
allows to
información,
have
tener
much more
también
information
como
nowadays
una participación a
as
través
a participation
pues de estos medios, pero
through
también
these
creo que
means.
hay
But I
muchas
also
organizaciones de la
think that
sociedad
there are
civil
many
que también
organizations in civil
han
society
tenido
that have also
un tiempo
had
difícil por la forma en la que se está
tough times
regulando las
now because of the
organizaciones de la
way that
sociedad civil.
the civil society organizations are
Pero
being
pues
regulated.
ahí
But
ya sea enterándose de cierto trabajo
whether
que hacen, haciendo
finding out
donaciones,
what work they're doing
participando en
in
los eventos que los
participating
organizan
in the
también,
events that they
hay
organize,
desde las
this
organizaciones que están
from the
trabajando con
organizations that are
migrantes, hay
working with
organizaciones que
migrants, there's
trabajan en
organizations
derechos
that
humanos con
work in human
comunidades
rights
indígenas,
with indigenous
con
communities,
mujeres, etcétera. Es decir,
women,
hay
etc. I
muchas
think
formas
there
en las
are
cuales
many
ahí
ways
cada
in
una
which
puede
each one
cómo
might
hacerlo, ya sea
state
a
how
través
to
de
do
donación
so,
de recursos,
perhaps donating
participación de eventos
resources,
como este
participating in
que se
events
llevan a
such
cabo.
as these ones
Eso es lo que
that
se me
take
ocurre por
place.
hoy. A
That's
ver
what comes to
en lo que
mind.
hablan mis colegas pienso en otras
And
cosas.
perhaps when my colleagues speak, I might
Bueno, si
think
me
of other
permiten,
things. Well, if
yo
you
creo que estar de acuerdo
let me, if you
contigo,
allow me, and if you
pero pues
agree,
seguramente también añadiría
who will
algo más.
probably will add other
Y
things.
yo diría, bueno, las
I would
universidades,
say that, well,
quizá porque me
universities,
desempeño en
perhaps
una de ellas, ¿no?
because
En
I
las
work
más
in one of them,
importantes, según
the
creo,
more
de
most important
México
one,
y de
I
las más
believe in
importantes de
Mexico, and
nuestro
one of the
continente. Pero
more
las
important ones
universidades
in the
somos un vehículo
continent. But
importantísimo
universities
de
are a super
interlocución,
important vehicle
comunicación,
of communication,
vinculación. Entonces,
interlocution,
en
linking
diferentes instituciones
with different
educativas
educational
podemos
institutions.
establecer
We might
contacto y
establish
cooperación
contacts and
entre las dos
cooperation
naciones, ¿no? Y
amongst
entre la
both
población de ambas.
nations and the populations of both.
También yo diría que
Also, I would say
podría ser que
that it might be
fomentando
that
la recurrencia de
promoting
este tipo de
the
iniciativas que ustedes han
recurrence of
tomado,
these types of
de
initiatives, like
realizar
the ones you've had,
conversaciones,
to have
talleres, seminarios,
conversations,
coloquios. La sociedad
workshops, seminaries,
organizada es muy importante. La sociedad
conversations. Organized
organizada, por
population is
ejemplo,
super
de
important. For example,
connacionales que radican en
national
Estados Unidos y
organizations
que tienen
living
un interés obvio
of
en
people
lo que
living in the United
ocurre acá
States
también,
that have
pues
interest in
entonces
what happens
con
here
este
as
tipo
well.
de
So with these
facilidad de la
types of
comunicación en tiempo real por estas plataformas tecnológicas,
easiness in
es otra manera
communicating
de
with these
conversación
platforms, that's another
interesante,
way
¿no?
to
Gracias.
have a conversation that I find adequate.
Pues
Thank you.
lo que yo puedo comentar
What
antes
I
de que
might
me vaya a dormir,
state
porque estoy en
before I
Ginebra
fall
ya
asleep
muy
because
tarde,
I'm in Geneva and it's very late
es que
is that precisely yesterday there was a letter of 1,500 civil society organizations to the president because they're looking for ways to have interlocution. Because unfortunately, in the last few years, there has not been a lot of discussion with civil society, and what was constant support has been weakened gradually. And what is very sad is what I've seen in other countries in Latin America is that in some cases, the doors are even closed for them. They would be the most serious case in Nicaragua and Venezuela, but we also had this in Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, where it seemed that the organized civil society becomes a threat against the state. So, but I believe every field of battle is important, and I then that the civil society is a very important force that helps in many, not only in the roles of the state, but also keeping an eye out and care of everything that takes place regarding public policies.
Gracias por compartir
Thank you for
a
sharing
ustedes, y también
to
muchas
all
gracias
three,
por
and
su
thank you very
tiempo
much
y por
also
compartir
for
sus
your time and
perspectivas,
for
doctora
sharing your
Boniface, que está en Ginebra,
perspectives,
así que
Dr.
está en un
Boniface,
horario
that
diferente
is
al
in
nuestro.
Geneva in a
Así que
completely
muchas
different
gracias por su participación.
um, hour than ours. Thank you so much for your
Y una pregunta
participation. Thank you very
para
much, she
la
says.
doctora
And
Pérez
a
Correa.
question for
¿Qué va a
Dr. Perez
pasar
Correa.
con todo el
What's
tema de
gonna
violencia
happen
y
with
delitos por parte de los militares?
violence
¿Cuál es
and
el
crimes
órgano
from
que
the
va a
military?
impartir
What is
justicia
the
con eso
organization
del fuego?
who will
¿Y de qué manera la
be
militarización en
providing
México impacta de
following up on
forma
this? And how
diferenciada a mujeres y hombres?
does this violence in Mexico affect
Ya,
in a
bueno,
differentiated
a ver,
way
ahí
women and girls?
creo que sí es
I
importante
think it's
enfatizar
important to
que hemos
emphasize
encontrado
that we have found
en México la
in
militarización de los
Mexico,
estudios en los
the
cuales, bueno,
militarization
obviamente hay
in
una
Mexico has
relación
taken
entre
place, have been
militarización
researched that
y
there's a link
violencia, no
between
una relación causal,
militarization and
y
violence,
cómo
but a
la
causal
militarización es causante
relation,
de
and
la
how
violencia. Y
militarization
ahí
causes
hay distintas
violence.
razones por
And
las
there's
que
different reasons
esto
for which
sucede. De
this
entrada tiene que
happens.
ver con cómo la
From
presencia
the
militar
get-go, how it delves
termina
with
por
how
hacer
military
que se
presence
disuelvan o que se
and
debiliten las instituciones
weakening and
policiales
dissolving
civiles, que también tienen
civil
un papel
police
importante para la prevención
organizations would
del delito.
play an important
Eso
role regarding
es importante,
security.
pero además
This is something important,
esta
and
forma en las cuales los
this
militares patrullan
way
las
in which the
calles con
military patrol the
armamento
streets
pesado
with
también ha llevado a
high
esta mayor
caliber
armamentícia en los grupos de
weapons.
delincuencia
So
organizada.
this
Entonces,
makes
tenemos,
for an
eso es algo
arms
que
race with
tampoco
the organized
se ha
crime.
tocado aquí, que es
So this is
importante. Hay
something
un
that hasn't been
problema
mentioned, which is
de armas
important.
en
There's a
México en el cual
problem with
nuestra
weapons in
frontera,
Mexico,
son
in
bastante
which our
porosas,
borders are
pero
very
sobre todo la
porous,
frontera norte,
especially
desde
the
Estados Unidos
northern border
entran
with the
muchísimas
US,
armas
from
a
which
México,
many
muchas se
weapons
quedan
come
aquí,
into
otras se
Mexico,
siguen
many
al
remain
resto
here,
del
others
continente.
move to the rest of
Entonces,
the
pues,
continent, and
sin duda alguna,
and
la
without a
presencia de
doubt,
armas,
the
la
presence of
disponibilidad de armas es
weapons,
uno
the
de los problemas que
availability of
tenemos
weapons
no
is
solo
one
en
of the
México,
issues
sino en
that we have
América
not
Latina
only in Mexico,
para
but in Latin
controlar la
America
violencia. Y se hace
to
poco
contain
por eso, ¿no? Por
violence.
ejemplo, en
And
México
little is
hay
done for
mucho
this.
trabajo que
In
hacen los
Mexico, for
militares, que
example,
hacen los policías
there's
para
very
detener
little
el
work done
flujo
by the
de
military, by the
migrantes al
police
norte,
to
para contener el
detain
flujo de drogas hacia el
the
norte, pero se hace bien poco para
flood
contener
of
el
drugs
ingreso de armas hacia el
to
país. Y
north,
eso
and
realmente
very little is done to
es un
contain the
problema. En el caso de las mujeres
coming
y
in of
niñas hay
weapons to the
distintos
country. In the case of
estudios
women
que se han
and
hecho de cómo
children, there's
afecta
different
la
studies that have
militarización
been
a mujeres y niñas. Y
done,
ahí me
and
parece
how
también
militarization
que no se
affects women
hacen
and
estudios,
children.
hay
And I think
percepciones bien distintas
there's very different
entre el modelo de
perceptions
seguridad en el
regarding
cual
the
nos
safety
sentimos
model
cómodas
with
las
which we
mujeres y
feel
con el cual se
comfortable,
sienten cómodos los
which women
hombres,
feel comfortable
es
and men feel
bien distinto.
comfortable. They're very
Eh,
different.
y entonces
And
hay una percepción
so
distinta sobre
there's a
cuál es
different perception
la
on
mejor
what
estrategia
is
de
the
seguridad y
best
cuál es una
safety
estrategia de
security
seguridad
strategy,
que
and
funciona,
what are
dependiendo
the strategies that
si las
work
personas son hombres
depending
o mujeres.
on if
Y nada más un
people
dato ahí
are
para
women
terminar.
or men. And just to
El
wrap
aumento
up,
de violencia en
the
México
growth
no
of
ha sido
violence in
muy distinto en hombres y mujeres.
Mexico has a different
En el
impact on
caso de
men and
los
women.
hombres,
In the
lo que
case of
sí
men,
vemos es
what
hoy
we
la
do see
principal
is
causa
now the
de
main
muerte en
cause
hombres
of
jóvenes
death in
es la
young men
violencia, son
is violence, is murders, which previously had been car accidents or vehicle accidents. Now we have homicides due to violence. And in case of women, women before died inside their homes. Now this tendency has changed, and now women perish in the streets due to firearms. So I think this is important because it is a phenomenon of violence that has had an impact on men and women. And this does not mean that women have stopped being murdered in their houses. This keeps on happening. It's just that it has been added to the violence that we experience in the streets. So the conditions in Mexico are brutal. We're seeing disappearances that are because the institutions don't have the resources to do the research. So I think this is one of the fundamental issues that we're seeing. The issue of violence is trying to be solved with military presence without researching and saying that the problem of violence is a problem of the judicial branch. And the thing is, making the military a part
Muchas
of
gracias
public
por
security
esa
is really not a good
reflexión.
idea. Thank you very much
Tenemos
for
una
those
pregunta
reflections. We
más
have one more
para el maestro
question
Vega.
for
¿Cómo es que se están
Professor Vega.
involucrando los
How
jóvenes en
are
temas de la
young
lucha del cambio
people getting
climático?
involved regarding
Muy
the
buena
struggles
pregunta.
for climate
Se
change?
están
Very good
involucrando,
questions.
yo diría
The
que
question I would say
a
they're getting
través de
involved through
la preocupación genuina que expresan
the genuine
en
worry they
las
express
viviendas, los
in
hogares, pero
their
también en los salones de
homes,
clase.
but also their
La UNAM, por
classrooms.
ejemplo,
UNAM, for
como
example,
supongo
as I
se sabe, no
assume is
solamente
well
es una
known,
comunidad
is not
universitaria que
only a
forma
university
profesionales, sino
community
que
that trains
educa
professionals,
a
but that
niñas,
also
niños y jóvenes desde edades
teaches
tempranas. Me
children and
refiero
young people from
preparatorias
early
o
age, and
colegios
I
de ciencias
mean
humanidades, por
pr-
ejemplo, en donde
um,
recibimos más de
trainings and high
115,000
schools where we receive
jóvenes
over
para adentrarse en esos
115
niveles
youth
y allí
to
expresan
receive education, and
pues
they
inquietudes,
express
ansiedad,
worries,
preocupación y
anxiety,
por supuesto que hay que
and of
abrir
course,
puertas para
doors have to be opened
la
so
información, la
for the
comunicación,
information, the
la
communication,
cultura, la
the
difusión de
culture,
los riesgos
the
y sí, están,
socialization of the
digamos,
risks.
bastante
And
atentas y
so
atentos
we're very much
a estos
attentive
escenarios de cambio
to
climático. No hay duda
these
de ello
climate
y en
change
las universidades
scenarios.
y
There's
las
no doubt
universidades
about that, and
más.
we're seeing that in the
Bueno, y
universities.
se involucran y se
And
comprometen
and they also
con
get
las
involved and
soluciones también,
committed
¿no?
with looking for solutions as well.
Sí, gracias. Y creo que
Yes, thank
tiene
you.
sentido
And
ya que
I
este
think
es
that
el
makes
mundo que ellos
sense
van a
that
heredar
this is the world
para
they'll
tener que
be
lidiar más con esos
inheriting, and they
impactos.
will have to be dealing
Y
more with
bueno, con
those
esto
impacts.
concluimos la
And with this, we'll
conversación.
wrap up
Les
with our
agradecemos a
conversation. We
nuestros
thank
expositores. Nos
our
excepcional que
three
no está, pero
presenters, although the
gracias a ustedes
doctor
por
had to
aún
leave. But
permanecer
thank you so much for
y por
staying
compartir con
and for
nosotros sus
sharing with
conocimientos y
us
puntos de vista, por
your
sus aportes en estos temas
knowledge and
tan
points of view
importantes. Y sé que
to this very
podríamos hacer
important
una sesión individual con
issues. And I
cada
know we
uno
could have
por
an
lo grandes que
individual
son estos
session with
temas,
each
pero
of
les
you
agradecemos por
for each of these
compartirnos
topics because we know they're
esta
really
conversación
big
inicial
issues.
para
And thank you
nuestra
so much
audiencia
for
y para
this
tener una
initial
red
discussion
más
with our
informada.
audience and
Nos
have a
quedamos con
more
elementos
informed
para entender el
network.
contexto
We're
y
left
llevamos
with elements
preocupaciones
to
claras y
understand the
reflexiones
context,
sobre
and
los
we're left
desafíos
with
que se
worries
enfrenta
and
o
understandings
presenta
and the
tanto a México y
challenges that
cómo desde las organizaciones
Dr.
unidas como
Sheinbaum
migrante en Estados Unidos
will be
podemos
facing
posicionarnos
in
y
Mexico, and
acompañar
how as
los
migrants
cambios
in the
para
United
hacer
States we
México
could
un
position
lugar donde las
ourselves
personas puedan desarrollar sus
in
proyectos de
such a way
vida
that
y
people in
disfrutar
Mexico
de
might
todas las
develop
riquezas
their
culturales
life
y geográficas
projects
que
and
tiene
enjoy
este
all
país.
the
Y antes de
beauties and
terminar, les
natural
quiero dar una invitación a
elements that
nuestra
this
próxima
country has.
sección
And
de
before
CD
wrapping up our
Divergence,
next, I want to invite you to our next
vulnerabilidades
webinar
entrelazadas,
sections of
abordaje del cambio
cross
climático y
vulnerabilities addressing
desplazamiento
climate change
forzado en
and
México y
forced
Centroamérica.
displacement in
Esto
Mexico and Central
será el
America.
próximo
This will
16 de
take place
octubre.
on
Tendremos la
October
conversación
16th.
en un
We'll have a
lugar a dónde ir,
conversation
la necesidad de
without a place
viviendas
to go,
resilientes.
the
Ahí
need
compartimos acá
for
el enlace de
resilient
la
homes.
inscripción
We'll
y se lo
share the
dejaré aquí en el
link
chat.
to the inscription in the chat and regarding the environment and the impact of life conditions and facing climate change and how this might have an effect on forest displacement. So we'll look forward to seeing you on October 16th. And once again, I thank our presenters and thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.
Muchas gracias a ustedes. Chao.
Thank you all so much.
Gracias.
Goodbye.
Gracias. Adiós,
Goodbye.
Sandra.
Adiós, un gusto.
Adiós, Eduardo. Gracias.
Hasta luego, Catalina. Chao, Sandra.